So just out of curiosity, so we're going to focus on self-evaluations and transition plans. This will take us to lunch. Last couple classes, we've actually broken this towards the end and broken for lunch, came back to finish it after lunch. We're spending a lot of time on this because it's one of the main reasons we have the class now. Many agencies are looking to get moving or make progress on their transition plans. Never raise your hand if you don't want to. I'm just wondering how many people have at least started their transition plans? Okay. Anyone feel like it's done or within shouting distance of done? What agency?
Carver County.
Carver County. Yeah, I agree. I've got some Carver County materials in here later on. So those of you who didn't raise your hand, I'm not going to embarrass you. Don't feel embarrassed. You're not alone. Very many agencies are looking to start now or are very early on in their process.
Brady, I want to interrupt you. I got distracted. I just had to get.
Do you need your microphone?
Oh. So somebody asked me at the break about the 3 to 6 inch standard for the truncated domes must fall behind the curb and gutter within 3 to 6 inches. Remember me saying that? There is a standard. There's lots of details where that is not the case, including the directional ramps. So don't panic yet, or don't call your guys and say, you got to rip out those domes before I get back tonight or anything like that. Just kidding. So just wait, okay? Because we're going to go through a lot of the details after lunch. And there are standards where that does not fall. So without question, I'm sure you're well within your rules of requirements. And we'll talk about that after lunch.
And the picture that was up when that requirement was shown actually did not follow the requirements on the corners. But yeah, we'll talk about that with the details and then show you the kind of ramps where that differs. Okay, we're back up. So this section that, as I mentioned, is going to take us at least to lunch. We'll talk about what those requirements are, so you can see the legal language where it spells out what agencies are required to do. We'll spend a lot of time on self-evaluations because that's where you'll be spending all your time, if you haven't discovered already. And then we'll wrap up with some transition plans. Again, the self-evaluations and transition plans tend to blur together, but we can treat them separate because some agencies are required to do the self-evaluation, but not the transition plan. So let's jump right in, show you what the actual requirements are from a legal perspective. First requirement is the self-evaluation requirement. Again, this is from the Code of Federal Regulations from the Americans with Disabilities Act. First requirement, self-evaluation. You must evaluate your current services, policies, and practices. Make necessary modifications to meet requirements. Part of that requirement, provide an opportunity to interested people to participate in your self-evaluation process. So it's a public process. They submit comments, have their voices heard along the way. If you've done anything to comply with the self-evaluation requirement of Section 504, you don't have to do it again. They essentially have the same requirements. You'll notice one is grayed out. It's not your eyes going bad. We've pulled this out as an extra requirement. If your agency has at least 50 employees, that's the entire agency, your extra requirement is you must maintain on file and make available for public inspection your self-evaluation for at least 3 years. Out of curiosity here, how many agencies have less than 50 employees here today? No one. From the metro area or what?
My agency does.
Sorry, which one?
My agency does. IMO Consulting Group.
IMO Consulting?
Yep.
Are you like the engineer for a given city or county?
We have an engineer that is going to be taking the class. I'm a construction manager. So
Okay.
Private.
Private. So these wouldn't necessarily apply to you. So this is for local government agencies. It looks like no one here has less than 50. We're still going to talk about this in case maybe that does apply, but There are fewer requirements if your agency has less than 50 overall employees. We'll call those out here. So essentially, if you have more than 50, everything I show, whether it's in a boxed in text or not, applies.
Brady, is that for public works agencies or the entire city staff?
Entire city staff. St. Paul's over.
No, I think consultants that maybe represent smaller municipalities.
Right. So in that case, it doesn't apply to the consultant, only the consultant employees, I guess, who would. I think I see where you're going there. It's a good question. If the agency itself, it's a good question if the consulting engineer falls under that agency's employee list. My guess is your city engineer would. Maybe one or two staff members, but not the entire consulting firm.
Except depending on what the project might be that brings in about consulting staff to work on that project.
When you hire a consultant, that they're not part of your city's employees that count towards this requirement. I believe it's FTEs, 50 FTEs on your agency. Next requirement, ADA information must be made available to applicants, participants, beneficiaries, and anyone interested. Like I said, this is a public process, a public document for the public good, and the public is part of that process. Extra requirement, so it sounds like required still of every agency represented here today. You have to designate a responsible employee, so a contact person for your transition plan and any ADA questions, and also adopt a grievance procedure so someone from the public knows who to contact and how to have their voices heard, how to file a complaint, and so on. Anyone here a person responsible? Nate? Knew that was coming. Okay. I won't put you on the spot. Last requirement here, you'll notice this is only for those agencies 50 or more. That is the transition plan. So the requirement is to develop a transition plan, setting forth steps necessary to complete changes required to achieve program accessibility, provide opportunity for the public to submit comments, and make it available for public inspection. Those were the requirements straight from the Code of Federal Regulations. Hopefully you can see that they are sufficiently vague, right? That's as much detail as they go into. So what I'm going to do here is give you a whole bunch of information on ways you can meet those requirements. And we'll start by talking about self-evaluations, because like I said, that's the big time component. Once you have the self-evaluation done, the transition plan itself is not that big of an undertaking. It's writing a document, it's formalizing coming up with the decisions that you write in your transition plan is difficult, but it's not a doctoral thesis that we're putting together here. We'll talk about that at the end of this section. We'll focus on self-evaluations first. Oh, sorry. So we'll talk about what it is, what we're looking to document. That relates to the yellow handout that you should have at your spot. Anyone not have the yellow handout? I passed it out during the break. We'll look at how you document, what methods of data collection and organization are available to you. We have some guides to help you project how much time and money it's going to cost, could cost. And then we'll have a lot of best practices, advice, and examples from agencies that have already been through the process, or at least started it. So, I have a slide here that I put it here so I say this. The big theme of this section is based on those vague requirements which you're required to meet. There is sort of a minimum level of effort that might meet those requirements, but that's not clear, right? So we're going to try to give you examples and help you figure out what that minimum level might be. And as long as you're doing this, as long as you're going through the effort and time to get at least that minimum level, we're going to show you what can happen if you go a little farther. It'll cost a little more time, a little bit more money to do the process, but what you can get out of it is much more useful, because ultimately you're tying it to funding decisions, right? Your transition plan is going to spell out what changes and when you're going to install them, make corrections of non-compliant infrastructure. So funding is all tied to it, and so you can, as far as meeting the requirement, that might be much less effort than getting something that's useful to you. Each agency is going to make their own decision on how far they want to go with their data collection, organization, and how it applies to their transition plan and all the decisions within that. So you know your own agency. You know, here we've got a lot of metropolitan area, larger or pedestrian dense infrastructure. It's going to be a little bit different than, say, where we were last week in Detroit Lakes and Bemidji. We had a lot of small agencies with, maybe a couple sidewalks to check in the series of small towns. So your agency is different from other agencies. We have a variety of examples to show. The whole idea is design your self-evaluation to lead to what your transition plan. Your evaluation says this is what we have. Your transition plan says this is how we're going to make those improvements that we discovered in the evaluation. If you know off the top of your head, though, where those high pedestrian traffic areas are, or maybe there's an urban core with a lot of pedestrian traffic, maybe it's near elderly care facilities or schools where you want to focus that effort. If you know where your money is likely going to go, maybe you start drafting this, give it an outline, and use that to help guide what data you're going to get right away. Because there's a lot of data that you're out there collecting. If you're not going to be able to take it on in one fell swoop, and trust me, you're not alone if you believe that. Let's be smart with those first decisions. So the big theme of this is I'm going to give you a lot of information to help you figure out what mix of data and time investment is appropriate for you. I think that'll be more clear as we walk through the examples. So again, what is a self-evaluation? It's required of all public entities by 2 acts of federal legislation. Its purpose is to identify barriers in programs and activities that prevent people with disabilities from access. So what are we evaluating? All programs and facilities that require public access. Clear enough? Not really, right? Essentially what this is saying is anything the government offers, anything the government provides, programs, facilities, everything. So we're talking sidewalks, APS, we're talking building entrances, the communication that's posted on your website, everything's got to be accessible according to all these. So that's a really comprehensive but still vague statement. We can break it down a little bit. We can break it down into rights of way, rest areas, parks, and trails, and maybe you can even lump those together if you want, if it works for your agency. And then your access to your buildings. That doesn't mention your program. So when SRF, when my company, I think other consultants are similar right now, when we help out an agency with their process, we typically recommend tackling the public rights of way first because it's tied to the FHWA funding in the short term. Knowing that you're ultimately responsible for the entire offering of your government, let's take off this piece here that seems to be the most time sensitive right now. We get that under control, we can look at your access to your buildings, we can analyze your polling and other services that are provided. So again, as an agency, you're responsible for everything the government offers. We're going to focus on this. Put another way, we're looking at barriers to accessibility. It can be physical barriers, structural modifications. It can be providing a service or an interpreter when necessary, and so on. There's also critical areas. Like I said, maybe those pedestrian dense areas might be a good place to start, considering that taking on everything is a daunting task. The end product is an inventory of facilities. There's no specified format. So I'm going to run through a couple examples in the next slide of what your inventory can look like. The whole idea is to form enough detail to help you start writing your transition plan, to get enough information that you can make some prudent financial decisions when it comes to where your money is going to be spent going forward. Some options you have are aerial photos, a spreadsheet of almost infinite variety, how much detail and how extensive you go into. You can use drawings, notebook pages, GIS mapping software. All are available to you at your discretion. So one example, I believe this is from the city of Richfield. They have a table, if you call this table, a summary that's within their transition plan calling out the highlights of their self-evaluation. So they have some data that they use to support this, but then in the self-evaluation they'll say 50% of sidewalks met accessibility criteria, 39% of curb ramps. By the way, that 39% is huge. That's way higher than we typically expect. It could be that they recently did a lot of infrastructure and so a lot of it was compliant. It could be that they missed a couple measures that didn't quite do it, but usually 10 to 20% somewhere where we see. Anyone who started, do you have a number you're willing to share on curb ramps?
37.
37. Okay. Again, so that's two high examples. That doesn't mean that if you have a 12% or a 20% that you're not doing as well. I mean, I guess it kind of does, but it's very common, you know? It's kind of a Yogi Berra quote there I just had, but.
Brady, can you
Yes.
clarify, would they be evaluating whether these programs were compliant at the time of construction?
So the question was, are the curb ramps being evaluated at the time of their construction? For the self-evaluation, you use the current in-place standards, which would be the latest ones, the 2010 ADA standards or the Minnesota Accessibility Code. So you can see here where it gets a little confusing because in that previous requirement to provide curb ramps when you're doing an alteration, you're not required to update those curb ramps if they're compliant from the old standards. But now in your self-evaluation, you compare everything to the current standards. So you may not have to update them back then. You may not have to update the ones that meet old standards as a part of that previous alteration, but you will have to address them with your self-evaluation and transition plan. So it might make sense to update those other ones anyway during your alteration. This is an example of a detailed spreadsheet. This is from the U of M concrete inventory that Ann and I were both on. You can see, so there's a spreadsheet entry, a row for each curb ramp, a column for essentially every type of thing we're measuring. So did it meet the running slope maximum of 8.3%? Yes or no? Did it meet the cross slope requirement of 2% max? Did it meet the width requirement? And so on. Did it have truncated domes? And so on. So there's a lot of data collected here, right? We took all this for every single ramp. What you could do is you could have a spreadsheet that has one column, compliant, yes or no, right? Perfectly acceptable to meet the requirement. And you can see why there might be less effort involved in that, because you can walk up to a curb ramp and say, obviously non-compliant due to a steep slope or no landing, non-compliant, move on, right? Took you 3 seconds to do that curb ramp. Or you can walk through the criteria and see how bad it is. The reason, so you see a benefit in saying, let's just have one measure for compliant or not, right? It's quick. You can move through it quicker. Let me talk about the benefit for taking more data. Picture two different curb ramps. One, non-compliant in almost every feature, right? It's a true hazard to someone with a wheelchair, for example, or any of us really, able-bodied. We might trip on it, it's too steep. In the winter, we fall down, there's no detectable warnings. It's a mess, right? It's too narrow. Maybe there's a structure in the middle of it. I got a picture of one that describes exactly what I'm talking about. Picture that ramp, and then one that's compliant in every single measure, but it's got a 2.1% cross slope. If you just use one column for that, they've become the same, they're identified as the same, right? They're both non-compliant. And it's true, they are both non-compliant. When it comes to deciding where your money is going to be spent, which one presents the bigger barrier to accessibility and the bigger source of liability if you leave it alone? See what I'm saying? So they're treated equal, but they're not equal. Probably a better investment to upgrade the one with nothing going for it. It limits your liability and someone getting hurt or making a complaint, and who knows how far that goes in the legal system. And you'd rather spend your money on that one, right? Because there's limited liability from the other one. Even if it's technically non-compliant, the chances of someone complaining about that ped ramp having a 2.1% cross slope, relatively small. Yeah?
I was going to follow up to that. I work in Hennepin County. We have like 13,000 pedestrian ramps. If we did something that you're showing there, we would like not get any work done. So instead, we split our ramps up into like 6 different categories and did what you talked about, where you have high priority locations where there's no ramp or the contractor was an idiot and just did a horrible job. And then you go all the way up to like new construction where we kind of assume they're compliant and the chances of getting a complaint are basically 0. So I encourage, if you have lots of ramps, to do that instead of this. because this is just like a paperwork nightmare. And if you lose your ADA transition plan person, they go take a job elsewhere, that is a very hard role to step into, trying to pick up where they left off.
Okay, thank you. More or less, I'm just going to repeat. The main point was if you've, like Hennepin County has over 13,000 ped ramps, taking this amount of data for everyone, they'd be doing it for the next 30 years straight, right? So the advice is maybe not go this far if you've got so many, or maybe you can find a middle ground where instead of just one column or 15 columns, maybe you break it into a couple different categories of failure, compliance failure, mostly compliant, and so on. That might be easier to do it that way rather than taking 15 measures at every single ramp. Is that paraphrased adequately? I'm just saying it again for the recording. And you know what? We actually are going to look at Hennepin County in some time later, so we'll dive into that more. Speaking of Hennepin County, they also used images as part of their self-evaluation. No reason you can't do this. You're sharing this with the public, and the average member of the public is going to look at this and say, yeah, that hydrant is a barrier to accessibility. It's in the way of that sidewalk. They'll understand that more, for example, than maybe trying to sort through something like this. So don't be afraid to use this approach that Hennepin County used. You can also map. Geolocation is not a requirement, but it certainly provides some usefulness. For example, you can look at this and say, all right, on this corridor we've got some blue dots and some green dots. What does that mean? Curb ramps with a deficiency score of 1 and 2. So they probably had 1 or 2 measures of non-compliance associated with it. And the mapping helps you realize if you missed a spot or if you're going to update it in the future, much easier to coordinate. Again, not required, but certainly useful, and we'll see more examples of that mapping. This was from Clay County, and so they tended to use a deficiency score rather than saying just purely non-compliant or compliant. They gave it a score, and we were able to prioritize that way. Just like golf, higher the number, the worse you did. I apologize, that may not be my last golf reference. So, we've already got the par, right? So, what to document? Starting in a slide or two, that's where this yellow handout comes into play.
Did everybody get one?
Anyone not have it? Okay. So, jump the gun there. I don't want to show that yet. This can be used. You can follow along and take notes on here if you like. It also can be used for a training tool. If it's not specifically you doing a self-evaluation, maybe you take this back and then walk through it with your interns or whoever else is going to be helping with your evaluation. It summarizes everything we're going to talk about here today. It may not be 100% inclusive. There may be a couple things to add to it, but it's a really good start. It basically takes our slides and puts it onto this in larger form, room for taking notes and so on. So what are we looking to document out there? I told you we'd talk about the right-of-way, and we will. This is the last time for a little while that we aren't talking about the right-of-way, but just a reminder that your agency is responsible for documenting things like the presence of alternative or auxiliary communication devices. For example, something like this that allows someone with a visual or auditory disability to communicate effectively with someone on your staff. So it might not be a room full of engineers taking this on, but someone at the agency will. And so this slide represents all those things internal to those services and communication elements that you are required to provide. So starting now, right-of-way stuff. There are some obvious barriers, right? Some other obvious ones. I hope this is Photoshopped. It's on private land, so you're not really going to have to deal with it, but the point is, there's a lot of ugly stuff out there. Thank you for the handicap parking and aisle, but I'm not sure quite what to do with it from there. Maybe there's a route around, but this will be a barrier you document. No access to the building, at least that we can see. What's wrong over here? It's a bus stop, right?
There's not a sidewalk to get into.
There's no accessible route from the sidewalk to the boarding area of the bus or the bench to wait. So that would be a situation where someone in a wheelchair or someone who needs that firm, stable, slip-resistant surface wouldn't have the ability to get to the bus. So we're going to cover these. I think this is where actually the handout starts with this slide. We'll look at sidewalks and trails, spend a lot of time on curb ramps, a little bit on APS, parking lots, bus stops. So let's start with sidewalks and trails. In general, 4 big areas to look at, sidewalks and trails. Running slope. Of course, that applies mostly to an independent alignment where you're not confined to a steep roadway. If you are confined to a steep roadway, you can match that existing roadway slope. Cross slope is a big one, 2% max. Geometry, we've got to have landings where we've got to change the direction. We need an adequate width in the sidewalks. And then, of course, vertical, and you can add horizontal discontinuities there as well. So he doesn't have to measure to know that's greater than a 1/2 inch, but that should be documented. And you could have it.
1/4 inch.
1/4 inch is the maximum deflection. It can go up to a 1/2 inch if you've got a bevel. So if this was smaller, you might be able to grind that and achieve a fix rather than replacing the panel.
Okay.
Here are those big 4 illustrated. This is our favorite picture that I don't need to spend any more time on. Cross slope, again, we think about the most limiting user, right? And it takes the exact statistic, so I'm not going to provide it in fear of being wrong, but the whole point is, as this cross slope goes from 2% to 3%, there's a significant increase in the energy expenditure. At least if you're in a wheelchair, you've got to expend to counteract that slope. You kind of have to steer it away, uphill, upslope a little ways. And so that affects all of us, right? If we have a cross slope like this, it doesn't matter if you're in a wheelchair or you can walk. In the winter, that's not going to be fun. And this is illustrating running slope, but what I want to do is talk about the driveway component. Very common, now this is a well-built driveway, right? That sidewalk is continuity right through the driveway. Very common, if it's not built like this, that the cross slope exceeds 2% across the driveway. So if the driveway continued through here, maybe it was bituminous that connected the street, you still have to have that pedestrian route meet PAR standards. So it's got to have a 2% maximum slope. Typically, we'll do a measurement every driveway to see if that cross slope is met. Ramps and stairs. Remember, curb ramps and stairs, crosswalks, they're all part of the overall PAR, right? So the same requirements for a PAR are still going to apply. Running slope and cross slope, for example, landings and turning space and width. In addition, for stairs and ramps, you've got handrail requirements, edge protection, and still those same surface characteristics: firm, stable, slip resistant. You'll hear it again. Same things still apply. So what you see here, we've got railings on both sides. Either the railing could come down closer to the ground, some kind of protective edge, or you provide a little 4-inch curb here. A 4-inch sphere cannot fit underneath. That's the standard. Handrails must extend into the landings at the bottom and the top of a ramp run. Same with stairs. The railing must extend beyond that bottom riser by at least a tread length. Those are requirements.
Brady, is that in the right of way?
This is probably not.
Okay.
And actually, I won't go there unless a question comes up because it's really hairy, and we'll just try to keep it straightforward here. This is not in the right of way. Could be, right? Well, there could be a ramp in the right of way. APS, Ann mentioned, is required at all signalized intersections where there's a pedestrian walkway.
I got a question really quick on that last slide.
Question on this slide.
So it don't have any landings because even for a wheelchair, that's steep, right? I mean, you
Right.
have a landing every 30 inches of right.
Correct. So the bottom,
So does it not apply to private
No,
industries? I mean, like, that could be a church. It could be.
the same requirements apply. And the question is, there's no landing in the middle of this ramp. So what's the deal? There has to be one at the bottom. There has to be one at the top, just like this shows. There would only have to be one in the middle if the height difference from here to here was at least 30 inches. Based on the number of steps, I'm saying it looks like it's probably under 30 inches, and that's why there's not a landing. Right out in the hall here, there's stretches. And I don't know if they have landings because it's only making up a couple steps worth.
We saw a landing.
There is a landing.
And there's one at the bottom, right?
There's one intermediate too.
Oh, right, because the drinking fountain's right there.
Yep.
Yeah, there is a landing in that one. It could be for the drinking fountain. It could be because there's at least a 30-inch elevation difference from the top to bottom. So APS, check for the presence. Very common that they're not there when they're supposed to be. The location, we'll talk about more this afternoon, but it depends. It has to be near a landing at the curb ramp or the corner, a certain specified distance off the back of the curb. If there's two buttons, if there's two crossings, those buttons have to be 10 feet apart minimum to make it clear which one is pointing to which crossing. And then these should be easy to activate. One of the standards is it should be operated with a closed fist. So if your disability has to do with dexterity, easy to activate that. You can just kind of hover over it or touch it with a closed fist. If you remember, there's older ones with like a hub with kind of a small button sunk in. Those are being replaced for that reason. That same kind of closed fist idea applies to opening a door. So if a doorway is to be accessible, it has to be operated with the closed fist, which means you shouldn't have to grasp it and wrench it, use a lot of force to open it. If doorways have a button that opens it, hydraulically or electronically, that meets all the requirements for an accessible doorway, generally. But you don't have to have a button to have it be an accessible doorway. There's a whole bunch of things like how the device is used. The force required to open the door has to be below a threshold. There has to be clearance requirements. And then it can't close beyond a certain speed. So once it's open, it should be slow closing to allow someone to have time to move through. Parking lots. We saw a chart earlier about specifying how many accessible stalls are required based on the total number of stalls for your facility. And those accessible stalls should be apportioned per parking lot if there are multiple parking lots accessing a building. They should also be located as close to the main entrance as any other type of stall. There's signage and marking requirements. A lot of questions have come up on these in previous classes, so I'll talk about a few of the things that have come up. These signs are required. I have not seen where these symbols are required. Certainly helps to have them. It's another measure to communicate that, but the sign is necessary to make it legal and enforceable.
It's interesting, because a lot of times you'll see the symbols, but no sign.
I was going to say,
Correct.
is it enforceable if there's not a sign?
No.
So you can fight that.
Anyone can park there if there's no sign without a penalty. That doesn't mean it's not the wrong thing to do, right? I'm not giving anyone permission to do that. I'm just saying it's only enforceable with the sign.
That's really interesting, because you do see that pretty often. It's really hard in the winter to know where you can park without the sign.
And you know what typically happens is on a set of plans, if I'm designing a parking lot, I'll put this symbol on the plans wherever those spots are, because that's how you review it. Review the plans to make sure you've got enough and in the right spot and that the slopes are okay on the grading plan. And usually they just kind of stay on there as part of your striping plan, right? And so they get put in. And it's good to have them there, but this is what's required, that sign. There's also a sign required for no parking in the aisle. You can see they're not here because the sign would be in the middle of the access route, right? Because it has to be at the head of the stall in the middle. You could put it off the back if this distance met a maximum requirement. I think it's 8 feet off the top of my head. Looks like you could have put it there, but if you can't put a stall here, or sorry, if you can't put a sign here, then you need to mark it like this. Have it no parking written on the stall. Slopes, anywhere within all of these accessible spots and the aisles has to be 2% max in any direction. Yes?
So that pavement marking for no parking is enforceable, but from a no parking standpoint, but for the handicap parking, the sign is enforceable.
Yeah. Let's not clearly understandable about that.
Minnesota statute is, and you don't have the Minnesota statute with the wheelchair. You know, if you look at the sign, it says under Minnesota statute, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Where it's not gonna be painted on the road, you know, so.
So I'm not going to say for sure this isn't required. I haven't found in the accessibility code where it is. I don't think it is required. Maybe the Minnesota law has something else, but that should contain it. That accessibility code should contain it. Anything else parking related questions?
Can you speak a little bit about the street parking?
Like that?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's also, these requirements also apply to on-street parking, which is probably more common in the right-of-way, right? Here, instead of having the sign at the head of a stall, it's off to the side. But I think actually here it's supposed to be towards the front. The drawing might be wrong, it's supposed to be towards the front of like the driver's end of the stall. Or maybe I guess that'd be, whatever way that's going.
I think that's 2 spaces, right? No, I guess it's 1 space and then that's the aisle. That is confusing.
And
The
also,
signage where it is confusing.
say that word?
Recommend.
Recommended. So the symbol is recommended. The other component here is you've got an access aisle that really pushes into the sidewalk. You can do that, or you can have the sidewalk be flush with the space and still allow this dimension. I want to say it's 8 feet. It could be 5. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. Same slope requirements apply. Same signage requirements apply, along with the location and number. Did you have any other specific question about that?
I just noticed the snow plowing in the city is always on the side of those spots where the ADA spot. So I don't know, at least hard because then they close the access to the sidewalk. So even if they find the spot, they can't get out of the car. They can't get to the sidewalk.
I see. So the question is about like snow maintenance in these spots? So the maintenance practice could make it non-compliant at that time. Yeah. So it would be a good idea to communicate with the maintenance staff to keep those accessible stalls open and the route from the stall to the building or wherever they're going to be open. Or you make sure that you provide something adjacent to it that can also be accessible parking.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
What's up with that Walmart parking lot there? Like, so they don't have a no parking, obviously it's where your pavers are. Don't you normally have your 8-foot space, let's say it was a van, he's gonna park, he's gonna get out on the passenger side? None of them, it's a space. It makes it difficult.
Okay. Question is about this parking lot in particular. How come there are 2 accessible stalls next to each other without an aisle between? That is okay, because you can back a van in, and so aisles can be shared by 2 stalls. So this aisle is being shared by this stall and this stall. This aisle is being shared by this stall and this stall, and so on.
So they really gotta think when they're pulling in that spot, they might not think about it and just whip in and then go to get out and go, crap. Now I have to move my vehicle and back in, and it's just weird that they would do it that way.
Possibly. Yeah, so they can back in. It's totally acceptable to do that. There was a point I was going to make there and I forgot. That might happen again too. No promises.
Well, many times you'll see a little sign underneath that says just van accessible.
Right, okay, there we go. Thank you. So technically every surface stall in Minnesota is van accessible. But what you see sometimes is maybe 1 out of 2, or just the ones with the one side aisle are marked van accessible. Technically they are all van accessible. Just a common misunderstanding. So I think there was another, so this one alternates it,
Right.
but then technically this one wouldn't have an aisle, right? Based on what you're saying?
It wouldn't.
But it's allowed to share this one.
It's still sharing, but that's just the normal way that you typically.
Look how that car's parked. I mean, you just The whole standard is that the aisle can be shared by 2 spots,
Right.
either side. And again, we've seen this before, but based on the total number of stalls for a facility, that's how many have to be made accessible. Always at least 1. So bus and transit stops, moving on down the list here on the yellow handout. There must be an accessible route to the waiting pad or shelter. Should be a landing for boarding, so someone can pause and wait and actually board the bus easily. Detectable warnings, especially on raised, like a bus rapid transit stop. If there's a raised curb with no guardrail or protection or anything, the whole boarding area has domes.
Grady, I had a quick question about self-evaluation of transit stops, and we talked about this before. But if you're the city and you have a very limited transit availability in your city, and it's a larger government agency, Metro Transit, that's involved or owns all the bus stops, who's actually responsible for doing that evaluation? Is it the city, or would it be transit?
So the question is, if you, within a city, for example, oftentimes Metro Transit or whatever the transit agency is, they've got the stops within your jurisdiction. Who's responsible for evaluating those? In general, it's the transit agency. I'm not going to say that, in every single city that's how it goes, but typically that transit agency has responsibilities to evaluate their stuff, their infrastructure. I wouldn't assume that's the case and leave it. I would coordinate with that agency to make sure. But then the other thing is it's probably worth addressing in your transition plan or somewhere in the evaluation that responsibility of those stops is in the hands of the agency, because you're probably going to get questions from the public, or they'll wonder why you don't talk about this, and chances are there's some maintenance associated on the city's part. So it's good to have it there, but the actual evaluation might be done by the transit agency. Anyone have an experience different than that? Yeah?
Add something to see the federal
Please.
regulations that talk about who has liability up for the ADA make it very difficult to point to another agency and say it's their problem. Because you can't aid and perpetuate or assist, or there's this list of other things. So I would consult with your city or county attorney or in-house counsel before you determine that that's not a point of liability for your entity.
Okay, thank you. So her point was that it's not clear to point to another agency to be responsible for something in your city, for example. So contacting your city attorney or someone is always good to make sure that's squared away. Yeah.
Is Met Council responsible for creating and maintaining an ADA compliance plan and similar?
Yes. Met Council is required to have a evaluation and transition plan.
So automatically it would fall to Met Transit then to make sure that what they have is ADA compliant.
Right, but the liability.
Yeah, my point is just that it wouldn't be necessarily just your agency's responsibility, but that it would also be Met Council and potentially the city where that stop is located.
So-
There could be multiple entities of liability.
Both groups. It benefits both groups, in other words, to sort it out and communicate. Good questions. If there's seating offered, like a bench or a shelter of some kind, also has to be accessible to a person in a wheelchair. Space for seating or space within the shelter. And then travel information should be provided in a non-visual format. So here are a couple things to note here. First, on this image on the left, I think there's a width, probably a non-compliant issue going on. Definitely a maintenance issue, right? The surface is no longer firm, stable, slip resistant. On the right, no connection from the walk to the bus stop. Easy one to fix, potentially, depending on grades. This one here, from Robert Street, I believe. Other than getting out there and measuring with the level and some dimensions, I can't immediately pick out something, I don't think, unless you guys can. I've been wrong once before. So I think another aspect here is this street has at least some considerable slope on it. The requirement is to provide a landing at boarding. This slope in this direction you may not be able to get that to be 2%, but you do need to make sure it's this way. Ann's got a slide this afternoon that talks about the landing requirement and how big that landing has to be. I think it's 8 feet backwards and 5 feet along the width should be a landing. But if you're matching roadway slope here, that's often the best you can do. Well, it is. Construction sites, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. You're not expected to go out there and evaluate every site under construction. You'd never do anything else. But the whole point is that the construction site becomes part of the PAR, or the PAR has to be maintained. And so it might be a matter of communicating your transition plan or your city standard plates and so on that contractors are required to follow the MUTCD in this department. So we're going to get into curb ramps here. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on this because that is a big piece of your evaluation. So we'll talk about all these things that Ann already brought up. In general, compliance can be achieved by meeting the following 12 requirements. So we'll go through these. Started out as a MnDOT list. It had less than 12. I added some to bring it up to 12 because it needs a good name, like the Dirty Dozen. Everything's better with a name. So again, some of these we're going to be review, but it's worth having fresh in our mind because we're going to look at some pictures of curb ramps out there, some examples to help you identify what's going on in some of the weird cases you're going to find. Ramp width, 4 foot minimum, or match your incoming sidewalk or trail. So if you've got an 8-foot trail or a 10-foot trail coming through, that's how wide the ramp is. Running slope, cross slope, 8.3% max, 2% max. If you don't have those numbers memorized yet, you don't have to memorize stuff, but it certainly makes life easier if you remember 2%, 5%, and 8.3%. 2% being the maximum cross slope or landing slope or gutter flow line slope, which equates to the cross slope of the ramp. 5% being the 5% doesn't have, well, okay. 5% is the maximum running slope that's not considered a ramp.
Longitudinal slope.
Running, longitudinal, interchangeable terms, yes. Once you get over that 5% barrier, then it's considered a ramp, or you need a landing in your curb ramp at the top. We'll see examples. 8.3 is maximum running or longitudinal slope. This one here, note 3, the ramp must meet MnDOT spec 2521. That's construction requirements for a concrete walk. So is the jointing perpendicular? Were the forms placed well? Was the curing done properly? Is the surface plane of the concrete? Is it within finishing tolerances? So anything have to do with workmanship of the concrete. Landing slope and landing dimensions we've seen before, 2% max, 4x4 minimum, or match the width of the incoming trail for your landing. Location should be at the top of the ramp if you have more than 5% on that ramp, or anywhere where the PAR changes direction. Truncated domes must be properly oriented, covering the entire curb opening, so that anywhere you're walking along that path, you cross at least 2 feet of domes. Proper drainage, can't be holding water. In the winter, it leads to freezing. If it's outside the winter, you're still going to have debris that makes your surface not firm, not stable, not slip resistant. Vertical discontinuities, not greater than 1/4 of an inch, except you can go to a 1/2 inch if you've got that bevel, that 1 to 2 sloped bevel. And really what this is saying is the transition from the ramp to the landing or the curb should be flush. And if you've got a walkable surface next to your ramp, flare has a 10% max. And because there's one more I felt that wasn't encompassed by all these little pieces, I threw in an extra one, so it's a dirty baker's dozen. Ramp's got to be in the right spot. It's got to connect your sidewalk with your crosswalk in a straight line. We'll see how that has not been met in a few cases. So let's go through some examples. We'll start easy. What's wrong with that one? Everything, correct. We're moving on. What's wrong with this one?
Too narrow.
Probably, right?
It's got a bump at the low line.
No domes. A little bit of settlement. Oh, you guys are good. I can't even tell. You're probably right. I just can't hear all the individual responses. How about the fact that it's asphalt?
Could be coming off of the trail. It doesn't matter that it's asphalt. I mean, you could
It
be
may
coming
not.
off the trail, and, I mean, your landing needs to be concrete with your truncated domes, which that would need to be fixed, but we don't know if it's a trail or if it's a sidewalk or what. But
Right, so you said a lot of stuff there that I'm pretty much going to repeat. Maybe not exactly how you said it, but for the most part, asphalt could be okay, although to get detectable warnings in, you're going to need at least part of it to be concrete. MnDOT requires concrete. Remember item number 3 or 4 was that it had to meet the concrete walk requirements. Also, if you use asphalt, it's very likely that your slopes are going to be off in some way. Because concrete, you can set the forms, measure them, adjust them to your heart's content. You can spend the whole day doing it. Sometimes you do. This, you get one shot. You lay the mat and either it works or it doesn't, and you're pretty much stuck with it. So I would highly, highly recommend not doing any bituminous. You're going to need at least part of it to be concrete to get those domes in.
Whole line for the gutter line there is not, what's the right word, it's too steep.
This slope?
No, coming off the ramp, so you see how it pumps.
Oh, this, the transition.
In the actual ramp area. So the wheelchair going up the ramp instead of down it, isn't that supposed to be like much more smoother?
This little lip here, you're saying?
Yeah, the one that contractors hate.
Yeah. Yeah, it's supposed to be flush, but you can have, if you can bevel it at a 1 to 2, then you can get a 1/2 inch there. That's still not very much. What do we see here? Hey, it's got the symbol, right? That's worth nothing.
they should have tapered layers because that's part of your walking sidewalk, and you'll walk right the hell off of that.
So this is too steep, right? This is a walkable flare situation, and those are way short of the 10%, or way beyond the 10% maximum. I heard someone say no landing. Correct. This is probably a 5-foot sidewalk. Maybe it's a little bigger, maybe a little smaller, but I think it maintains the par, except you need a landing at the par.
If you're walking through, you put third par and trying to get maintained.
Oh, this way. Right, so that's why this is a walkable slope. So someone would be expected to navigate that. It needs to be a gradual slope. Either they should have ramped down here, ramped back up across the whole thing and made this whole area low landing, or this would have had to be pushed back to provide a landing beyond that slope.
That's a wide sidewalk, but it looks like you've got minimum of 80 once you get to the top of where those tapers stop at the top of your curb, which is not enough to say, okay, now I got a 3-foot landing, you must have 4 foot.
Right. So there's no way we got a 4x4 landing at the top. And if we did, this would have been way too steep, right? Because it's making up that probably 6-inch curb height in just a few feet. No domes. We'll move on.
Coming off, you've got a bird path, then you got too much of a lip on your curb there going into the street with the gutter line.
So drainage problems, lip at the curb.
No domes, too steep of tapers.
No domes, too steep of tapers.
No landing.
Correct, no landing. It needs a landing for 2 reasons, right?
That's your slope.
It's for sure steeper than 5%. I'd say it's probably more like 17 or 18%. So you would need, this is too steep. You need a landing right here to accommodate this slope and the change in direction of the sidewalk.
Your domes are pushed too far off, they see your curb.
I'm not sure that the domes are too far away from the curb, but they're not oriented properly, right?
Well, that's what I was trying to say, you got too much.
Okay, oh, I see, okay.
In front of your truncated dome,
And the dome orientation gets worse than you think, unless you already picked this up. But it looks to me like there's 2 directions of crossing.
right?
It's a rare situation where you've got a sidewalk on one side and then crossing from there in 2 directions. So when that's the case, you've got to change the direction right here, which means it's got to be a low landing. But then why can't we just put that landing and why can't this end?
That whole thing would have to be rebuilt because you got a storm drain there, so to actually build it right, you'd have to relocate your storm drain and everything else. So you got a lot of stuff going on that's not good in that. Your taper's too steep on that side by the storm drain.
This is too steep because of the storm drain. Storm drain prevents you from having a low corner. Clearly this ramp suffers from being shoehorned in here at the last minute, right? So this is a lesson in planning ahead and knowing where you're going to need a ramp and what's in the way. So either we would have had to move this pole. Maybe there's a right-of-way issue here. It's too tight that you don't have any room. But we could have either tried to swing it away with some more landing space out here. Maybe provide a little boulevard here to achieve that. Or ideally, you just move the structure, right? It might not be in the scope of all the projects. Maybe you replace the casting with something that isn't part of the curb box.
Maybe get rid of all the crosswalks.
Yeah, there's only one ped button anyways. And it's not
Right.
an illegal place and it's not a legal ped button.
You guys are good.
It's easy to spot junk.
They'll get better, I promise.
To build quality for customers.
They'll get better. We're trying to give some variety here.
Can you go back to that one for a second?
Yeah.
So that catch basin there?
Mm-hmm.
This is a conversation I had when I was at Lincoln County. So we get a lot of complaints about in the winter, you could have positive flow, but sometimes with a lot of snow, the gutter is packed with snow and then the water will sit there until the spring melt. So if you have a catch basin that close, and if you could even design one to be near it, you could then just have the best practice to clean out that gutter to that catch basin, and then your winter water problem kind of goes away.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, so I think we'll see some other situations.
So even in the winter, the water could drain to that catch basin, which is 10 feet away or so.
Right. So the comment was about making sure during the winter, if you allow water to get to this catch basin, you can avoid that ponding issue. Hopefully there's enough slope there to do it. We'll see some examples where it's questionable.
Is that a fire connection right there at the corner?
It's a hydrant. It looks like a hydrant, yes. So lots of things in the way here that would have had to have been handled at the beginning of a project. And if you get to the end of a project and you've got to put something in that fits, you do the best you can, but I don't think this is the best they could do just looking at the domes themselves. This one here, what do we see? How's this slope?
Oh, your slopes are coming in weird right there.
This is well beyond a 2% slope, and therefore the gutter flow line is too steep. Your cross slope is going to be too steep because of that.
Longitudinal slope is too steep coming in, you don't have a landing.
So the longitudinal slope is too steep. This is probably not flat enough to be a landing.
But you need a landing a little bit closer down.
If this is within 15 feet of the back of curb, this could be your only landing and you could ramp down. But the jointing is really funny. It's not perpendicular. Again, so here, this is an exposed aggregate detectable warning, which could have been compliant a while ago. It's not now. There's a lot wrong with this one, but I do want to call out that number 13. It does not line up with the crosswalk. A bunch of other stuff wrong with it. I think you guys have done enough to let me know that you understand most of that. So here's a different style, some variety for us to consider. This is a parallel ramp, so the landing is at the bottom of the ramps. That's okay. There's a detail for that kind of ramp. There's a subtle aspect of this one that I want to see if you catch.
The curb should get to the full height.
So the comment was, this transition is too gradual. Is that what you're saying? You should go from 0 height to full height in a shorter span?
Oh, you got like, what, 6 foot, I believe, is what it calls out.
So that, actually, that's okay. It is preferred to have it shorter because it's an more easily detectable edge, but this is okay. Especially if this slope is more like, it keeps it under 5%, for example.
There's gotta be something with the curb in the back, the vertical curb in the back next to the parking
It's like a
lot.
little warning.
So-
I was gonna say, what's
In
the
the landing.
truncate domes need to be facing the travel direction?
The problem is if you did that, then you lose your landing spot.
Okay, there are a lot of comments. I'll see if I can address them. One comment was about this curb in the back. That's a V curb. It's okay on its own as long as it preserves a 4x4 landing in front of it. So if you had a 4-foot wide sidewalk and the V curb cut into that space, then the landing is non-compliant. This is a pretty good strategy to use when you're dealing with a higher tie-in at the back of your ramp. So that's fine. I heard that the domes are eating into the landing space. That's okay. It can be part of the 4x4 landing.
They're facing the wrong direction.
I also heard that they're in the wrong spot, more or less.
They look like they're in the right spot, just,
They,
you couldn't slide it down the way that built, you know, and it looks like.
so it looks like the crossing is this direction, and the domes occupy, for the most part, the whole curb opening. If you're walking through here and you come right across here, you might miss a full width of domes. That's true. They're close. They're close. Because of the whole angle, I mean, this is a spot where you've got the sidewalk at the back of curb and a weird angle of crossing. I think it does a reasonable job. You might be able to say that, hey, it should have been a little bit farther this way. But there's one more thing to call out before we move on.
The ramp's the low point, and I'm guessing the water flows away from the roadway.
Do you see this debris right here? That may be an indication that there's backfall, that water comes from the curb and into the ramp here. It could also be debris from up in here.
You got a catch basin just now for that. So it's hard to tell really.
Right. So other lesson here is without actually knowing slopes, we don't know for sure. We're just kind of looking at things and calling them out. What I want you to do for a little bit before we get into the nitty-gritty on this one is look at how crisp these lines are. Now, I wouldn't have used expansion foam there, but it's a good visual for seeing the grade breaks, right? So grade break at the top of the ramp. You've got a joint here and here. Everything's crisply laid out with as far as the jointing, except it looks like the landing is kind of funny, if you can see that. Without measuring, I think this one's doing a decent job. I don't know what the slopes are. However, if we look across the street, it looks to me like the connection between the ramp and this regular walkway is too steep to allow a landing. Again, we'd know that if we had a level out there in the field.
I'm not sure I'd call yellow on white a contrast.
Correct. So this is not Minnesota, and that does not contrast. Those yellow domes do not contrast with the concrete.
In Minnesota, is there also a requirement that you can see, it looks like you got a striped width of 10 feet, but your dome's only 4? Is there a requirement that your domes have to equal the striped width?
I don't believe...
10-foot straight crosswalk, you have to have 10 feet of domes.
Well, your domes are 2 foot wide, so you try to put them the full face so where your tapers come in and get the full width of curve.
If you can oversize the crosswalk, the domes don't have to be the width of the full crosswalk, but they do have to be the full width of the trail or incoming sidewalk. So let's take a 10-foot trail, for example. Let's say we had a 10-foot trail rather than a little connection like this. Then the domes would have to be the full width of that trail, and then the tapers would happen outside of that. So for a 10-foot trail, you're looking at something like a 22 to 24 foot wide curb cut, right? For your 10-foot wide opening and maybe 5 or 6 feet on either side for your transitions. So the other thing about, in a previous class, someone had a question about, so if this sidewalk here is, let's say it's a 6-foot sidewalk, what's the minimum width for the ramp here? It's 4. It's 4. It's a minimum of 4 because there's not a real direct connection of that path to the crosswalk. You see what I'm saying? Like
In Minnesota, if it was Minnesota, it would be like probably a 6 foot if you could do it. But it states minimum of 4, but this is a different state, so it's probably only 4 foot.
Where the ramps get you down not in a direct line with the incoming path, 4 foot minimum applies. If your incoming sidewalk is wider, and essentially that the ramp provides a continuous connection like that, like for here, this is a sort of a broken connection with the walk, right? There's a change in direction. Right out front, when you leave today, if you parked in this lot, maybe it's over there, I don't know. It's sort of a plaza area of concrete with some defined ramps leading down. Those are 4 feet minimum. It wouldn't make sense to have the whole thing be. Does that make sense, that sort of difference? Maybe we'll see some more examples as we go.
So what you were saying, they almost made it too big, like on the opposite side of the street if you look. So they got that 4 foot panel off of their tapers that you don't really need that there. It's just making it so much wider, you know. You see where I'm talking about, right? No, over.
Say it again, sorry.
So there's a little panel next to the grass.
This?
That right there. Yeah.
They wouldn't have needed that, no.
That's extra concrete that then need to be poured.
Right.
Just to make a...
Yeah, it doesn't really have any impact on the compliance, but could have not paved that, correct. This one here is too steep. Not by a lot, but it is. I just happen to know because I took the picture.
The longitudinal?
The longitudinal slope is too steep.
Just barely.
Yeah, not much more.
I think it's around somewhere in that high 8 range. I think it's still under 9. But what we did here in design is we raised this roadway profile as much as we could without messing up everything else around it. We sort of played with the cross slope to get this edge higher to make this as gradual as possible, and we still just missed it. This distance from the curb to this pad up here, it's less than 15 feet, but had it been greater than 15 feet, that triggers that landing requirement. But then you're having a steep slope and a landing, and then you have to chase it back even farther. You'd have to rework all this, which was not going to be part of the project scope.
Where's that at?
Might be somewhere in St. Paul.
Might be the maintenance facility by the parks?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
So the whole point is, this is close. It was probably the least objectionable resolution to come to when we couldn't get everything to play out and be compliant. One thing I want to point out on this one, it looks like this slope is pretty steep, right? What they did here, looks like it's steep here, and then they tabled it through here to make it as flat as they could, so that gutter slope through the par is 2%. And then it looks like they made it up again here. And that might be a steep way to make it up. You could have extended out farther, but that's the whole, they did some pretty good effort to do that. For the most part, I think this one looks pretty good. It looks to me, it doesn't show up in the picture that great, but I believe there's a landing right here, flattens it out. So this has a slope, flattens out a little bit to achieve that 2% landing, then it has a ramp down. What about these flares here? Would that be walkable or non-walkable?
Non-walkable.
They are non-walkable, so you wouldn't even need the flares there. You could just grade the turf. What would you guys do in your agencies? Would you put the flares in for maintenance or leave them out?
Well, like what we were saying before, flared for the snowplow coming around the corner.
So maybe for maintenance, you...
To ride up on, or else they tear the grass all the hell.
Right, because of this curve and plowing for ease, it might make sense to have the flares there, but they wouldn't be required. What is required, since it's a non-walkable surface, is that you have a 1 to 6 maximum slope on those flares.
And that's a sidewalk, not a trail, right?
Right. There is a connection to a trail right here. It's right by the same spot. So this is, again, a parallel ramp. Ramping happens parallel to the curb on either side of the landing, which is at the bottom. One thing you can see here really clearly is that the perpendicular jointing, the neatness associated with that, fairly easy to get your grades to be compliant when you have that sort of clean 90-degree relationship. What I do want to point out is the slope here on this little ramp piece and this piece. If it's greater than 5%, It can be anywhere from 0 to 8.3. If it's greater than 5, you need a landing at the top as well as at the bottom of the ramps. If it's less than 5%, you don't need that landing. They use bituminous here, which indicates maybe there's not a landing up there and the slopes are okay. You can have your landing in bituminous. Like I said, it's just tougher to make sure on your grades because you get one pass at it. Without being out there with a level to know exactly what's going on here, I think this one looks pretty good. Anyone see anything that I missed?
Looks pretty good, but I guarantee you that's steeper than 8.3, so they probably just paved their land and lost it as they took off.
I don't think it's 8.3.
It looks like
It
it.
matches a parallel road slope though, so you're kind of saying that.
Okay, so one other thing to point out that think about a 10%, well, think about this slope that's required here and right here. If there's any sort of longitudinal slope on that trail, these ramps would be different lengths, right? Because in one case, the slope difference is helping you. The other side, you're chasing it away. So it's important to remember that to get these both compliant, chances are one of them is going to be longer than the other. Or you just make them both the most limiting length and deal with it there. This is a depressed corner type of design where this whole lower area is low street level, follows landing requirements of slope, provides crossing this way and this way with domes over the entire curb radius. One thing to pay attention to on these is the drainage issue, because when the whole landing is low, you might have a gradual slope or some backfall in places if there's some settling. So a depressed corner, we'll talk about these different types of curb ramps more in the afternoon. Depressed corners are generally not preferred. Sometimes it's your only option, but they're generally not preferred because of the drainage problems that happens in that flow line area. From a ramp perspective, I don't know of anything necessarily non-compliant here, as long as this slope is okay, this slope is okay, and the landing is 2% max any direction. Yes?
From a user perspective, wheelchair, not so much a wheelchair, but a visually impaired person that's using a cane, how do they determine which way to cross the road?
Just about to ask that.
So the question is, how does, from usability, how does a person decide where to cross?
I know they got their sound cues that they use.
Those aren't APS.
That's another reason why depressed corner is not preferred. It's not as clear. This one does have a big problem with the APS. There's one pole there, right?
I was going to say, there's one on the backside across that way and one going this way, right?
So there are two buttons on this one pole, which only makes it make it more confusing.
Right.
I don't know.
Separated by 10 feet.
They have to be, the horizontal offset's too much for a wheelchair. The horizontal offset is what, 6 inches max?
A 10-inch reach. Maximum of 10-inch reach to the button.
But there has to be a length.
Based on this footing, you might already be out past that 10 inches. But there should be a second push button pole here. Maybe a pole over here that guy's crossing that way, and a pole over here that guy's crossing that way.
And if they had those two poles, that would be another way for that blind person to figure out how to get across.
Correct.
Well, they got the pole on that other side of the street you can clearly see. But on this side, they're just mounted to the stoplight pole.
The preference when you have crossings in two directions is to have two separate ramps, right? One that's clearly defined crossing that way, one clearly defined crossing the other way. We'll talk about this afternoon why you wouldn't do it that way, and this is probably a situation where there wasn't enough room to get the curb height up to 3-inch minimum between the two ramps, so you made the whole corner a ramp. Again, a lot of times you're stuck with this situation. You may have a little bit at your disposal to try to manipulate the sidewalks to work for the different directional ramps. We'll talk about that this afternoon.
Are you seeing issues, if you go back to this picture, from a semi-blind or blind person, someone who can see color differences? The whole reason we have truncated domes are mandated to have a visual difference from the surrounding pavement. What about the cobbles that are next to it?
Yeah.
That looks like a truncated dome to me if I squint.
Yeah.
Right here.
Yep. Feels different.
So that could be. The question is about the pavers or the cobbles that are here tend to look like the truncated domes, and would that throw off someone with low vision, for example? That could be, and so maybe you want to keep pavers farther away from the intersection. The next couple examples have pavers, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. So this is a directional ramp.
There's your pavers up at the top.
We got pavers up at the top here as well. Here's your domes that look a lot like it from, if you have low vision. That's a good point. So there may be a way not to do that. Maybe it's better not to do it in this location. Or you pick a paver that contrasts a little bit differently. Now, the domes should be detectable with the cane and different than the paver.
I was gonna say I can see his thing, but if you don't have, let's say you're not legally blind, you just have very poor vision. Once you get up there, you can see that clearly it's stamped concrete, a paver or something, but the domes are a lot higher and your little positionings are much closer together, so it's a clear when you're scraping your cane, this is a crosswalk. This is not a paver.
Right, so the comment was about you should be able to differentiate between the domes and the pavers. Domes do have specific measurements and dimensions called out to be detectable, different from the pavers. There are no requirements or limitations on where you put pavers in proximity to truncated domes, but it may be something to consider if your dome color is very similar to your paver color. This one here, if you're walking on this side of the sidewalk, you miss a full section of domes and you miss the curb opening, correct? So the curb opening should have been extended in line with the edge of the walk. You see the domes get to it, right? They get to the edge of the walk where that joint lines up, but that should be a full section, so they should extend farther. And then you do your transition farther out here. Question?
I said that would push your opening back for your paper and everything in that corner, so maybe there wasn't a possibility to do it.
It should have been. All you'd have to do is remove and replace another section of curb probably in order to move everything this way by that foot or so.
Well, that's a huge radius, it looks like from there right now.
Yeah, it's like at a skew.
We're only seeing one little small piece of the picture.
Okay.
Brady?
Yes.
They came down and asked us if we would eat lunch at 11:30, so
That's
is that okay? I'm sorry.
I mean, this is the first time we've been told when we have to eat.
Yeah.
If it works better for that, then
Yeah, we're the only group, so they've asked us to do that, if that's okay.
how about would 3 more slides be okay? We could get to a good spot. We'll zip through it. I know now that you've heard food, you're not going to listen, but I'm going to go through it anyway.
And since I'm interrupting, I'll just interrupt. When he's done, we just head upstairs. Lots of you have been to conferences here before. It's a buffet line, so we just go up to the main floor, which is one elevation higher than us, and just take your food and go through the line. And when Brady's done, I'll announce what time we'll get started again. We'll probably go somewhere around 40 minutes, okay? If that's okay with everybody? All right.
Okay, so here you have a hoagie and a cookie. Sorry. I show this one because it's my favorite example. I think it looks great. It's got crisp jointing. It's new. It's got definition of the par is not affected by the pavers because the par is the ramp, the landing, and the rest of the walkway. I think it looks really nice. However, and I'm pretty sure the slopes are okay too, but I don't know without measuring them myself. What I want to call out is this ramp in the previous slide is right here. Where is it dropping the person off, or how do you get there? It's in the middle of an intersection.
They haven't painted.
So what I want to say is if you're evaluating this one, it's probably going to be compliant, and it's a great example. I think we can talk about the pavers as well. But I think it's a beautiful ramp. It's in the wrong spot. I wouldn't mark it down in your evaluations for being in the wrong spot. There's no reason to tear it out, right? Maybe there's a plan for it in the future. Maybe I don't understand enough from the picture, but
So what are your concerns?
I don't have one, except I don't know why it's here.
Just to make it that all intersections, does she want to achieve 100% accessibility? It's a whole other story if you want to mark the crosswalk. Does that make sense?
Yes. Wondering It's not really lined up. I mean, it's in the middle of the intersection.
Is there a receiving ramp on the other side?
No. I don't believe so.
It's poor design. I'm guessing the other intersection.
Maybe there will be one. I don't know.
No, because it's a 4-lane divided roadway. And we would not want to mark the
Okay.
crosswalk there.
So I'm just saying it seems to me like it's in the wrong spot, but otherwise I think it's a pretty solid example. This is the last one. This also appears to be a depressed corner receiving a couple public sidewalks and it looks like one private. So this whole lower level would have to function as your landing. So there's a change of direction here in a number of spots.
They did a good job doing it.
It does look good for the most part. You can find a couple little things here. I don't know what this slope is. Hopefully it drains. It looks like it's pretty clean. These flares, even if they're non-walkable, are too steep. Right? And then it's a depressed corner, which means there's crossing in 2 directions, yet there's only one APS.
Crosswalk doesn't appear to line up.
The other one probably comes up on auto recall. Does that make sense?
Auto recall?
So the intersection lacks APS, but the ped phase would come up where that one-way sign is automatically.
Okay. It still wouldn't meet the criteria for APS. The ramp is okay with respect to that, and there is a service there, but it's still non-compliant with APS.
So we would need another signal.
Yeah, another crossing button. When we get back from lunch, we'll talk about our methods available for collecting data. So, Ben, and people can join us as we're midstream here. So, we spent most of this section previously talking about what we're documenting. Spent a lot of time on curb ramps. So now let's switch gears. We've concluded that section, concluded your yellow handout. We'll talk about how to document. So what process, what are we doing on the ground? The optimal way, the only way to establish compliance of any of your infrastructure is through an on-ground survey. So you're out there, your interns are out there, someone's out there taking measurements, measuring slopes, determining in the field if things are compliant or not. You have some other methods available, windshield surveys, aerial photo studies, record drawing reviews, and so on. These can be used to get you started and identify things that are definitely non-compliant. But the only way to really establish compliance, get some useful information, is to be on the ground measuring. There's a reason this is on the cover of your manuals. This should be a very familiar exercise once you've been into your self-evaluation. So a windshield survey, I'm pretty sure it gets this name because you can drive around, maybe even in the Google car, without leaving your desk, and be able to identify some things that are non-compliant. This specific shot isn't the best example because I can't necessarily pick anything out that's non-compliant, but if there were no domes here, for example, or something was obviously wrong about the ramp or setup, or if it was an intersection that needed APS, you could use this to say, hey, here's a list of things that are non-compliant. You don't even have to get out of your car, or maybe even leave your desk. But you can't look at this ramp and tell me that it's compliant from this photo, right? You got to be out there measuring. Aerial photos, another tool, assuming everything's updated. You can use it to identify gaps in your accessible route, places where you don't have domes on your ped ramps. Really useful for parking lots. You can count the number of stalls, especially if there's a pavement symbol piece. And record drawings, I would say they're really not useful because you'd have to have a really tight connection between what was built and what was documented. I would not recommend using these. Where they might have some value is on a roadway profile, for example, through an intersection, the roadway longitudinal slope, which you can tell from the profiles, matches your crosswalk cross slope, right? So you might be able to look at it and say, this intersection's at a 3% grade. We're going to have some crosswalk excessive cross slopes there. One example. But really, it's got to be an on-ground survey to have any kind of useful information on what's compliant and what's not. As far as documenting and organizing, Washington County and the city of Minnetonka have these maps, GIS associated with where their measurements are, coded by compliance or non-compliance. So, if someone on your staff is able to take this on, very useful strategy, not required. We've seen the spreadsheets. Here's an example of a pretty beefed up spreadsheet. A lot of information here. You can decide if it's too much, about right for your agency. We do have a short instructional video in running a level. Bear with us. Technology is not one of my degrees, but I think it's set up to where we can get it to work here without a whole lot of trouble.
I just think that's funny how to run a level. Take the level and set it on the ground and read the directions.
They might not know how to turn it on if it's a smart level.
Well, Brady did not know how to turn on mine, so I guess that's true.
Hey, I am the expert. Why would you say that? So this video was put together by the City of Brooklyn Park for this class today.
The Americans with Disabilities Act requires access to public places and programs, and the pedestrian curb ramp is an essential component in providing access. There are specific slope requirements based on ADA standards for pedestrian curb ramps. Today we'll be taking a look at how to measure cross slopes and longitudinal slopes. The maximum cross slope is 2% and the maximum longitudinal slope is 8.3%. Another critical component of a curb ramp is the landing. A landing is a relatively flat area for transitional movements with minimum dimensions of 4 feet by 4 feet. A landing is required when the longitudinal slope of a ramp exceeds 5% or wherever a user is required to change directions. There are slope variations and inconsistencies within most ramps, so multiple slope readings are recommended to be confident in an evaluation. A 4-foot level will produce a more reliable result by assessing a larger portion of the ramp and reducing the variability in measurements. As a bonus, the 4-foot level can be used as your measuring device. If the width of your ramp or landing is at least as long as your level, you know the minimum width has been achieved. An alternative method to inventorying ped ramps can be done by using an iPad application. This device takes 500 measurements per second to determine an accurate slope reading and determine if the ped ramp is ADA compliant. This has been an introductory video for inventorying some of the critical areas for ADA pedestrian ramps.
Well, I want that iPad application.
Does anybody use that iPad application?
You know, we've used it. I wasn't involved with it.
Uh-huh. Brady, can you tell them anything more about that?
The iPad? I personally haven't used it, but there are applications you can use for it that it walks you through a whole series of questions related to what the measurement you're taking. It gives you your geolocation, right? So that can be uploaded directly. You can start answering a series of questions. What type of ramp is it? What's the running slope? And then it can take your measurement for you. However, if you remember from the video, remember it said that a 4-foot level is preferable to a 2-foot level because it rides out some of the slope variations within a given ramp. So if you've got some waviness, maybe it's detectable by eye when you look at it, maybe it's not. But this will be highly variable by any kind of shifting in slope. This can ride it out a little bit more, get a more comprehensive measurement. So the iPad is going to be more precise than this is, but it's also going to respond to those fluctuations, and it covers a small area. So you're going to have to do a little bit to make sense of your measurement.
Would it be possible to hold your iPad on a level to record the data?
Yep, like a, put it,
Both ways though, so you need a plate on a level.
Yeah.
To record longitudinal and horizontal at the same time.
yeah, on a board maybe.
Well, where I was thinking that would come in uber handy is before they even pour any concrete, like if it's new construction or rebuild or whatnot, and you're out there and you're trying to measure the form boards to see if we got everything coming in proper and...
Yeah, I mean, you can use it in place of a level knowing that this has some benefits and the iPad has some benefits. For your evaluation, I would say the iPad can be linked to GIS, give you GPS locations, and it might be a quicker way to get more of that data associated with slopes and everything like that. We did use it at the U of M concrete inventory, right? No, not the laptop?
We used
It was an app, right?
We used a GIS-based app on the iPad. So all of when Brady and I did that project with SRF and Braun, we had an iPad app that students used to geolocate where they were taking data, which was infinitely helpful. We've done this class several times, as you know, and, oh, I don't have my microphone on, sorry. Just thinking about the recording. We've done this class several times, and people have told us how they've started doing some of their data collection. Clearly, just making copies of worksheets is useful and certainly takes away any technological barriers. The challenge with that is transferring the data back then into something that does geolocate them. So at the university, literally millions of square feet, thousands of ped ramps, but the students were able to geolocate where they were. So before they left an intersection, they would see 4 or 5 or however many ramps were at that intersection. They would say each one had already been inventoried. So that was very useful. However, we used the 4-foot and the 2-foot levels to actually do the grade analysis. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on too, how we did that, unless you want me to keep
I think
talking.
this is right now. Yeah.
Okay. So just some best practices and some lessons learned from our data collection at the university. First off, the university was very adamant that students would do the work, so they were looking at it as an opportunity for students to get some good summer experience, which I would advocate because it was pretty inexpensive. Plus, they were interested in doing long hours of pretty easy work, okay? They started out using a 2-foot level. I just purchased these at Home Depot. And while these are a great tool, look, it still hasn't turned on, so you're right. So when I said Brady didn't know how to run this, I was actually, not user error, but tool error, okay? Instrument error. Anyway, these just came from Home Depot, and I started out using the 2-foot levels because frankly they were on the shelf and I just went and grabbed a bunch. Brady came out about 4 days into our data collection and pointed out that we really should be using a 4-foot level, which is in fact true. The 4-foot level gives you much better cross-slope data because you get it over the entire span of the panel. The 2-foot level, he could show us just immediately how you get different results with a 2-foot than a 4-foot. Now, the 2-foot can be helpful to you. Later on when I talk about construction, I'll talk about tolerances might actually give you a deep, if a contractor finishes and pulls a little concrete out of the middle of the panel, he could actually cause a 1/4 inch deflection through the center. You will catch that on a 2-foot level. You'll bridge that with a 4-foot level. So sometimes having a 2-foot level is a good thing. Also, when checking gutter grade, a gutter slope, you're going to check that with a 2-foot level, not a 4-foot. So actually, my students were outfitted with a whole golf cart so they could have a variety of levels to use. So it's not you always use a 4-foot, although if I had to pick one, I'd pick the 4-foot. As I said in the video, the 4-foot level is great because it also can be used as a measuring device. So you can see if you have that minimum 4-foot clearance. We had a big job. We didn't know how long it would take, and students were required to measure the compliance for every ped ramp on the St. Paul campus, East Bank, and West Bank. So you can imagine what a job this was. We had 6 students who worked full-time doing this. So they measured every ped ramp. They measured they checked for 200 foot passing spaces. As I mentioned earlier, they had to make sure that if there was ever a section of pavement, of sidewalk that was 4 feet wide, there was at least a plaza, a building entrance, something within 200 feet. They checked gutters just for kind of a maintenance issue. That wasn't part of curb and gutter they checked, not as part of ADA compliance. They checked handrails and stairs, and they checked entrances to buildings. Anyway, a few things I can add. We did find that when we said to my 6 students, okay, you 4, you're just on ped ramps today. That's it. That's all I want you to do. We had much increased efficiency because prior to that, I had 6 students go out, and whatever they would intersect with or encounter, they would stop and measure. So they did a ped ramp, then a stairs, then a slope, then a passing.
area, it became pretty scattered. So they would be like, oh, what am I checking for on the stairs? But if I said, you guys just do the ped ramps, then they could like get really into it and remember what their standards were. One thing we figured out, this afternoon I'm gonna go through all the different pedestrian curb ramp details. A landing is pretty clear if it's pretty clear. If it's not pretty clear, it's hard to figure out what the landing is. Do you know what I mean? Some curb, like we could walk around this block and be like, oh, there's a landing. It's real easy to see. It's kind of right at the top of the ramp. You go to a challenging pedestrian curb ramp, you might not be able to figure out which is the landing. And even us together might be like, no, that's the landing, that's the landing. We found that unless Brady really spent some time with them, they didn't really know what the landing was. So we ended up doing about a week's worth of work over.
Even in this video, it was hard to see where the landing would have been because of the jointing. If the jointing is perpendicular and with grade breaks, much more defined, easier to tell.
Yeah, a couple other things, and then I'll let Brady keep going. With the iPad, we didn't use it for grade, but we did use it for geolocating, and students took a picture everywhere. Seems like excessive. Boy, did that save us. Because what we found is, we started right after semester ended, so like mid-May. We found about a month or two in that our data wasn't updating, and we actually lost only about 2 or 3 weeks of work. The reason we only lost 2 or 3 weeks of work is we were able to do an analysis of the data and match it with the photos and figure out where things started to deviate. So Braun was doing the data analysis and they're like, hey, ding, 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 something's funny here. We're getting all replicated answers. And again, it was an Esri linked product that wasn't, for whatever reason, it wasn't updating. Then we were able to look at the photos and be able to determine when we had to redo the work. So having a photo of every ramp seems excessive, but frankly, it's free, right? It's just data. And that really helped us a lot. It also helps if it does for quality control. So for me to get this project, I had to develop a quality control plan for the university. If you think about it, you could go months without really checking, and who's to say that you did anything correctly, right? So we had criteria that every so many days I had to look through the data and do a visual inspection to make sure that in fact students were still doing the data collection correctly, which is how we figured out that we had a bust in our data. Also, I had students we had big maps on the side of my office, and students would not only have the geolocation on the iPads, but they'd also highlight on a paper map, because it was really easy to miss things. So you guys know how that is. You're driving, you're like, well, did I pass that exit? What happened? Same thing with doing corners after corners after corners. You get to the point where you go, I think we didn't do all 4, or we didn't do that plaza. Students would have to look and actually highlight on a map for what data they got. What other best practices have I shared? I can't remember. I did have 2 students in charge. So students are great, love students. I got 2 in the back of the room. Hey, Jake. But the challenge is they need somebody to check on them. Having 1 in charge is a little challenging, because then what if that 1 is sick, or they don't kind of have somebody to help them when they're trying to be assertive? So I had 2 in charge, and then the 2 could help each other kind of keep everybody on task. You had some input?
Quick question. Did you have any of your students go out and inclement weather to check and see if there's any ponding or anything like that going on?
You know, we didn't check ponding specifically during rain. It was during the course of a summer. So I'm sure it rained, and I do remember that, but I don't recall that that was part of it. You made me think of one more thing, traffic control. So the university initially, we're going to set up a traffic control zone at every intersection, which if you consider the requirement, I told them, okay, if you want this done in 4 years, we'll set up a zone every time. But after 1 day, that was oppressive. Even just hauling around those huge cones was a huge pain in the butt. So we ended up getting approval from the university that if my students just wore high-vis vest and hats, and we did put up, when we were like along University Avenue or Como, the university actually owns quite a bit of interesting right-of-way. So if we were in an area where I considered it to be in need of a sign, we had one of those survey ahead signs, which probably did a nice job of slowing people down, but we didn't have people set up traffic control. It was really oppressive. I don't mean that that's what you should do. Everybody needs to make up their own decision, but it does take a lot of time if you're going to set up a control zone just because people are out on the sidewalk. People just need to be smart and not be like backing up into traffic when they're doing their measurements. What else?
A couple other quick things that make sure we mention is wherever you get these from, they're going to come with calibration instructions. Calibrate at the start of every session. Probably a couple times a day would be a good idea. Last thing you want to do is have to redo a whole bunch of ramps because this wasn't calibrated. You will start to notice if you've used these for a while that, or if you've used the level in any other, maybe inspection or something, a 2% slope has a pretty characteristic, the bubble looks a pretty characteristic way, with a quarter of the bubble outside the middle range or so on. So if you start noticing that relationship changes, calibrate. And it wouldn't even hurt to document when you calibrate. And then also, it's easy when you get in a role doing this over and over, you kind of get in the mode of setting it down, writing the number down, going on, or whoever it is. Make sure you keep an eye on what exactly you're measuring and does it make sense. Because if you're measuring a plane and one end of the level is a little ways off the ground, your measurement isn't going to make as much sense, right? We're looking for accuracy.
I don't know if you noticed it, but in the video when he set it down, measuring his truncated dome, he actually had it on the
Yeah,
top
that's
dome
another thing to
part,
be careful
which
of.
threw off his
Right.
measurement, and you didn't see him remeasure it.
Right. So we have the video's not perfect. It did mention a couple good things about using this as your measuring tool as well, and taking multiple measurements because there is variation, especially if you're near the cutoff of one of the 5% or an 8.3 or a 2%.
One last thing, I think I'm on. When I taught this class at Ramsey County, a guy came up to me, he goes, "You got the wrong kind of levels." So after Brady said, get the 4-foot, I just went to Home Depot and I got 4-foot. They were about 4 times as much, but I didn't realize that you can order ones that have the readout on the horizontal edge. Notice, this means every time you check it, you got to bend way over to see a vertical readout. So as these start to die, for sure I'm going to get the ones. I'm sure you just order them online. I see you nodding. Do you guys have that kind? Anybody?
We have all sorts.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is the readout face is horizontal, so you don't have to bend quite so far. It is labor intensive, which is another reason you might want students out there doing this work. Just the whole day, every day, 5 days. Say again?
Knee pads help.
Knee pads. I don't know that we use knee pads. I did give my students a golf cart to kind of help them out a little bit. So it went much faster than we thought it would go. Say again?
I didn't see.
Oh, anybody?
I may have said something.
Okay.
So the part that's required is taking those measurements, right? A lot of what we said is just advice to try to help you with your accuracy, with your efficiency. Anything that relates to the mapping, the GPS component, the apps, not required, but it's useful. And it's sort of up to you to figure out if that's going to be how you want to structure it, or if you've got a way that's going to work better for your own agency needs. So let's look at some examples of how much time and then therefore dollars this effort is going to take. Obviously, your agency's commitment is going to vary on how much area you have to cover, how urban it is, how close everything is, the type of data you seek, your method of collection. All of that has an impact. And we didn't come up with some crazy calculation to help you figure out exactly how long it's going to take you. But we do have some examples that can hopefully help you figure out a range or target. Maybe you have a budget in mind for this. So MnDOT has some average expectations. I don't believe this necessarily accounts for urban versus rural. It's sort of all lumped into one pool. In general, they thought 1 hour for a mile of sidewalk. So if you think about it, it normally takes you maybe 20 minutes to walk a mile. It takes you about 3 times as long to stop and take measurements, analyze deflections, and so on. Curb ramps, about 20 minutes per intersection. And if you get to a full signalized intersection with a number of APS buttons, up to 8 curb ramps, about an hour. City of Hopkins, I know a little bit more about this one because we were involved with the actual evaluation portion. We took a data point, one for every curb ramp, one for every APS button, one sidewalk point per block, and one per driveway. All told is about 30 to 40 data points per hour. That's with a team of 2. If you account for some data analysis, some setup, things like that, any kind of inefficiencies, maybe down to 25 data points per hour. What it all means is about 45 minutes for an urban intersection, 20 minutes for rural. Clay County, different kind of area. This is up by Moorhead, a little more spread out. They thought 2 to 3 miles a day per sidewalk. So it could be that they're taking more measurements. This is quite a bit behind the pace that MnDOT said, which would probably get you around 8 miles a day. Could be that everything's spread out, and so there's a lot of lost time in transporting everywhere. Or maybe there are just more measurements. Maybe a cross slope measurement more often. I'm not sure why. But curb ramps, 15 minutes per quadrant, and then 45 to 60 minutes per intersection. So we're starting to see a little bit of commonality in how long it takes to do a full-blown intersection of an hour or a little under. Hennepin County, 368 miles, took 2 interns, 2 summers, that many sidewalks. And we heard earlier, Hennepin County, I think he left, but over 13,000 curb ramps, took over 1 year with 1 vehicle. And remember, they said they didn't measure every single piece of every ramp. They sort of lumped them into usable categories and generally said it's a failure, it's mostly non-compliant, it's compliant, it's mostly compliant, and so on. So they had a series of intermediate categories that they put ramps into. They also use a GIS software and Trimble GPS. So we're starting to see here, hopefully you can see a little bit of a range, figure out how many miles of sidewalk you have, how many curb ramps you have in your jurisdiction, maybe apply some of these to try to get at how much time you should be expecting. Anyone else? Yeah.
Just a quick question. Is this separate from any survey that you're doing with your surveyor, whoever your surveyor is, the check that you're doing through here, these last 2 slides, is that independent of that survey? When you're talking about the time and all the time?
So the time would be related to doing a self-evaluation, going through your city or your county and taking these measurements. I believe it's separate. I'm not quite sure what you're comparing it to.
You could come along with your survey and do your mainline sidewalk every 50 feet and get your longitudinal, and then you just come back with your level and maybe hit some of the tricky spots with the 4-foot. I'm wondering if that longitudinal survey or the drainage survey is not part of this discussion here.
I believe it's separate.
Okay.
Maybe we can talk later if I'm not quite grasping it, but are you talking about a survey that would be done as part of an upcoming project or just as part of this evaluation process?
You got to survey the drainage in any given quadrant or any given intersection. It's not, you're not using your 4-foot level or your eyes, or you're using the actual survey equipment.
Yeah.
Is that?
Setting it up? Like that?
We'll talk about it.
Okay.
You could shoot the whole thing. Get you great.
You could. That would probably take more time.
It takes 2 seconds to take a shot.
Okay. Well,
It does.
Or 25 or 30 shots per row.
I mean, because you have to set it up at another intersection, right?
Mainline longitudinal.
Primarily in your drainage. So if you're doing your checks with your 4-foot level for your ADA compliance, that's irrespective of any of the surveying that you've done for the project itself.
Right. Yeah. And typically this is an exclusive process measuring your existing infrastructure as opposed to something that's got a project lined up.
Yeah. Okay.
So we have some best practices to talk about. NCHRP, MnDOT, and local agencies all have a few things that you can take as advice from. You have this NCHRP document in your workbooks. It's a pretty big document. It was originally intended for state governments, state DOTs, but a lot of the principles still applied at the local level. And we've given you some selected charts like this one that continues on the next page. They also have keys to success after every section. We've taken all those keys to success and consolidated into a handout in your workbook. But this, we won't go into detail on all this, but this table, based on the type of the issue that comes up, there's possible barriers. You can look through this. Again, we've talked about a lot of this, but this might have a few that we didn't mention today. The Department of Justice has another document called Common Problems for Local Agencies. You also have that document. And in there, it talks about a lot of these things outside of the right-of-way. So we're talking about the right-of-way primarily in this class today. A lot of the things that are pulled out have to do with your services and other things. We'll go through a few examples here. So city governments often believe existing programs and facilities are protected by a grandfather clause. Not necessarily the case, but it could be. If you've got an old historic structure, maybe a staircase leading up to it, replacing that whole building might be an undue burden where it would make you wouldn't have to redo that building. Be other ways you could achieve that. We'll see it on the next slide, I believe. We've talked about everyone here has at least 50 people in their agency, so all these requirements that we talked about at the beginning of the section apply. But those entities less than 50 would have some requirements they don't have to meet, which we talked about. So here's one. City governments often fail to ensure the whole range of city services, buildings, and programs are accessible, like your public meetings, any kind of city function open to the public. That must be accessible. And accessibility can be achieved either through structural changes. That would be the expensive option, obviously. You can also move those public meetings to an accessible building or relocate specific services to accessible levels or parts of a building. So you can achieve accessibility without having to, go through intense structural changes where a cost would prohibit that. A handful here. This one is related to the right-of-way, obviously. City governments often do not provide enough curb ramps. Transitioning back out of the right-of-way again. City governments often fail to provide materials in alternate formats. We'll talk about this later this afternoon. Braille, large print, audio cassettes. Remember, communication is affected by disabilities, just like we talk about the right-of-way being. 911 systems must be accessible. And then this last one here, law enforcement agencies often fail to modify their policies, practices, or procedures. Example being, it's very common to arrest someone and have their hands tied behind their back, right? Well, if that person is deaf, if that detainee is deaf, you've taken away their ability to communicate. So it might be a matter of switching practice to be in front. I'm not a law enforcement officer. I could see how one might have a problem with that, but it's the kind of thing that needs to be addressed to prevent discriminating against someone with a disability. This is a MnDOT. Also in your handout, you have the MnDOT form that they use during their self-evaluation. Questions that are answered. It's got GPS linked. We're not going to go through the whole thing in detail, but you can start to see they've got what we're looking at, notes on compliance, and you'll see the standards over here. 4x4 or greater, what might that be referring to?
Your
landing area. 2% slope or less, 2% slope or less, and so on. So it's a good guide, and if you follow it, great practice. It's not required. It might be a good educational tool for those who will be doing your self-evaluation. You can run through this and understand exactly what they're looking at. Along with that, they have a condition rating guide. Excellent, good, fair, and poor. A rating of 1 or 2 would be required for compliance. So again, you have that in your workbooks to look through and use as an example. So let's talk about some lessons from those agencies that have already made progress on their plans. Big one here is identifying priority areas. So it may come from citizen requests or complaints. Maybe there's some area of your infrastructure, your jurisdiction, commonly receives those complaints. Pretty good place to start, right? Let's get data there that's in your transition plan. Let's move that higher up the priority list. Maybe it's related to the population density or where you expect to have a lot of pedestrians. Maybe it's an urban core. Maybe there's an incidence of disabilities, an elderly care facility or a school of some kind, hospitals. Start your search there. Great way to make the most out of your efforts at the front end. So again, concentrating your effort at those high priority areas. If it's not within your time frame to be able to take on everything at once, start where there's going to be the most good to come of it. It also limits your liability. Right? If you target the areas where there's more pedestrians, more disabilities, that's limiting your liability by hitting those high areas first. Big common one here, even in our discussions at lunch, we talked about interns. There's a high correlation between agencies that have made a lot of progress and using interns. Again, it's not required, it's just advice. Generally the most cost-effective way to do the bulk hours of your evaluation. And then many recommend storing data with GIS. Geolocation, again, is not required, but hopefully you've been able to see that it's helpful. And then as you make ongoing assessments when your infrastructure updates, easier to keep track of where you've been and where those changes are. Agencies often say avoid reinventing the wheel. Agencies that have done their transition plans or evaluations, they're available online for the most part. By definition, they're available to the public. So it's not super difficult to go and find and see what Otter Tail County has done, what's Ramsey County done, and so on. You can also use consultant experience. If they've worked with a handful of agencies, they probably have the process down. They might even have a template of what works. Give you a starting point right there. And then when we work with agencies, we typically talk about doing the rights of way first. So maybe handling rights of way and or parks separate from your buildings. Just as Ann said, she had her students specialize and break into tasks. You can do the same thing with your evaluation. And then if you're going to take a minimal amount of data, consider jumping up where you have at least can identify ranges or categories to help you prioritize within your transition plan what's going to receive funding first. Handful of examples to walk through here from throughout the state. Baxter, we were just there on Thursday. No one from Baxter was there. I was a little but we did have the consultants there that worked with the city, so we have a little bit of background here. Baxter did all their self-evaluations over the summer. So they did 324 curb ramps, 24 miles of trails, and so on. This summary is within the body of their transition plan. And in their appendix of their transition plan, they've got more data from their self-evaluation. Here's the spreadsheet that they showed in their appendix. You can see they've got curb ramps called out by intersection, quadrant, what day it was inventoried, and then compliant, yes or no. Now, this happens to be a summary. They do have more data taken other than just compliant, yes or no. But this could be your spreadsheet right here.
How many did they have working on that? Because they did a lot on 713, looking at, and
so that's
for a ped ramp,
an hour per intersection. So that could be, here's one intersection. They've got 3 or 4 ramps at that intersection.
They may not have done to the extent, like Hennepin County's got 13,000. We have several thousand ped ramps. We did not go and have someone lay a smart level on every angle because 98% of the ramps that failed easily visually. You could walk up and go, nope, and walk away. That was red.
Right.
That's red. That's yellow. If you got the one you thought was green, that you thought might pass, then get the smart level up. Save yourself a bucket of time.
Right. So the burden to show compliance is on those measurements. You can look at one and say, yep, no domes, non-compliant. So it can streamline your effort. But as I mentioned, that maybe that's adequate. That'll meet the requirements. You can identify it as non-compliant. As you're making those funding decisions, it helps to have a little bit more information to separate the bad ones from the really bad ones.
What about the ones when the act was, you said it's changed a few times, right? As
The requirements?
truncated domes were put in, they were taken out, put in. So now, if you're not doing any rehab work in that area, and it was ADA compliant back in the 90s, and it's still in good shape, does it pass, or are you gonna fail it?
So the question was about something that would have met the old standards, right? But
And it's still in good shape.
it's still in good shape. You still have to assess it, evaluate it in terms of the current guidelines.
If it fails on the current guidelines, 'cause
Then it's a non-compliant. If it fails under the current standards, Todd, is that incorrect?
It's actually a safe harbor provision.
For the requirement of updating your curb ramps during an alteration, right?
Yeah, but if an extended the time of install, there is a safe harbor that allows that to be met. The biggest one is domes that went in and out.
And that's part of the self-evaluation effort?
When you come up with new projects, yes, that's where you have safe harbor. You wouldn't necessarily have to upgrade that curb ramp if it met the standards at the time.
Okay,
Kinda like it's
so,
grandfathered in.
so if you couldn't hear that, Todd had the point that there's a safe harbor provision, which we talked about this morning with respect to alteration projects and those curb ramps. So if the curb ramps in place meet the standards that were in place at the time of their construction, you don't have to update them in that alteration project. But Todd, could you verify with me here that in your self-evaluation, you'd use the current standards, but then you could address in your transition plan that they met standards back then, and so maybe that's why you're not prioritizing them in your transition plan? Is that okay? Okay. Good, that's what we've been saying in 7 classes.
You don't want to go teach those 7 classes again, do you?
Email. So they have similar data for their APS. They call out who owns the APS structure, and you can see this is pretty useful in communicating with another agency. The city owns all of them, except these 2 at the bottom here are called out as MnDOT. So they're on a state highway. Call out the intersection, whether it's non-compliant or compliant, and some notes to go along with it. They have a mapping component. We'll blow part of this up so you can see in more detail. But they've got their whole jurisdiction in there along with where the data came from. So you can see they've got non-compliant and compliant ramps, the trails that they went through. Pretty useful information, right? We'll see their example transition plan in a little while. I have not overlaid them. It would be kind of fun to see how their non-compliant infrastructure translates into a project. I imagine it lines up in many cases. Sibley County had this same kind of summary within their transition plan. Since they're a county, they broke it down by city. So the major cities within their jurisdiction, they grouped the infrastructure that is compliant and not compliant within there. Pretty good source of information so they can communicate with each city in their improvements. Clay County, remember this is where Moorhead is. I showed an example of them early on in this. You'll see it again here. They used a compliant point system. So essentially a measure of non-compliance gets a point. If there's a section of sidewalk missing, automatically 6 points. That bump it up into a high priority type of improvement. No curb ramp, 3 points. So you can see they're starting to differentiate between something that might be off on a slope versus it's not even there. Jumps it up the schedule of what needs to be done. They have pictures associated with it as well. And that mapping component, we've seen this already. You zoom in and you can see their compliance, everything's located with their compliance score. Hopefully you can see that this is useful information, whether your agency has the resources and interest in pursuing this depth of data. That's for you to decide, but hopefully I can show you what the result or the payoff is, especially when it comes time to make those funding decisions. Nice to have more information than less. Hennepin County, again, our representative from Hennepin County left, but they have a mapping component as well. So they break it down into a compliant, appears substantially compliant, Doesn't have a dome, high priority, medium priority, low priority, coded with location. So that's a method they took, sort of an in-between route of saying strictly yes or no compliant and taking a lot of data. Another component to this, so at the previous Metro class, there was someone else from Hennepin County. They informed us that the shading of green, you see that each neighborhood is shaded green. The darker the shade of green, the higher the incidence of disability based on census data. That's available, right? It's public census. It's probably a shape file from GIS. Have it overlaid with all this stuff. Pretty useful. Again, that's not required, but I think you can see why you might want to know that. Their APS data was broken down per city. So you can see how many traffic signals there are, how many have APS, how many don't have them, and we're assuming that they don't have them but require them. And you can see that the numbers in the with APS column are much smaller than the numbers in the without. So it's a pretty good start. They know where a lot of their improvements are needed going forward. And again, they took the pictures. When you communicate to the public, pictures are worth many words. So let's jump into transition plans. That was a self-evaluation piece. Again, that we're going to talk about transition plans have entered the self-evaluation conversation, and self-evaluations will enter the transition plan conversation. But depending on the size of your agency, small agencies don't require this, so we broke it into a separate piece. Yes?
Something that I'm missing here. Everybody here is going to have to do a self-evaluation. For those of us that already have, what's the requirement to redo it? Because we're a developing county. We see thousands of houses being built every year in our county. Lots of infrastructure changes every year in our county. Lots of new trails, lots of new sidewalks. How many years down the road are we going to be federally required to redo this self-assessment?
It's a great question. Anyone else here wondering that same thing? Oh, sorry, I'll answer this and then we'll...
Okay.
So there is no explicit frequency for how often you have to update it, but what you did call out is the fact that things do change. This is a living document. I think a lot of agencies sort of hope to go through the process once, check the box, file it away. Not the case. This is sort of updating your operating procedure. Always look for opportunities to improve accessibility. This document lives with your agency. Should have ongoing updates, but there's no explicit requirement of how often you have to redo it. Yes?
So I work at Met Council, and this is the question we've posed to Federal Highway with their initiative. And the response I've been given from Federal Highway in Minnesota is that an update should occur at least every 5 years for the public right-of-way. I mean, that's, like you said, there's nothing in the federal regulations that specifies that. But this was the answer we got from Federal Highway Division in Minnesota. Too many infrastructure changes would occur beyond that, kind of knowing the plan of its importance and relevance to what we're on that. So I think that's our Federal Highway Office's expectation going forward.
So to sort of repeat, say it into the microphone, it came from the Federal Highway Administration. They recommend, as a recommendation, to update every 5 years, but there's nothing in the explicit ADA language that says that you have to do it so often. Now, originally, we haven't talked about this yet today, but when is your transition plan due? 1992, right? That ship has left the harbor. So what we have now, the reason, as I mentioned, that we're really talking about this today, is we're starting to see funds being withheld from the FHWA. I can think of a couple agencies that have dealt with this year, as recently as they have moved their transition plan up to be able to get funding for a project that's coming down the road. So that's one aspect. There's no future date thrown out. It doesn't mean that there won't be at some point. We're starting to see the snowball gather some critical mass and start rolling down the hill. So I can't tell you where it's going to go. The other thing to consider, at the end of the day, we're going to talk about enforcement. And the Department of Justice does some reviews where the timeline for all of your improvements will be bumped up according to that. And there's also some liability in terms of legal aspects without compliance. So a lot of things indicating that it has to be done, you know, forget 1992, but there's a little bit of urgency now. Start here and then, yeah, over here.
So is Met Council willing to share that email with the group? Just so we can have
Yeah, that'd be great.
And then, or just, we're telling our agencies that we're working with ADA transition plans is, I think similar to what you said, is just as you work every year to provide infrastructure, you know, you're paying a lot of money for a design and you're doing compliance checks, and it's just one last step to now add that compliance check to the database you've already created to self-evaluation. And then it becomes a living document. And say green is new constructed compliant ramps, your map suddenly looks green over 20 years.
Right, so that, just to repeat for the recording here, reiterated that it is a living document, and over time, as you make improvements, your maps are going to improve, right? You're going to have more green if green means compliant.
But I would also offer that the standards and the guidelines are a living document as well. So they seem to change readily. So what you're making compliant now, 15, 10 years from now, may not be compliant because of the fact they changed the standards or they changed the guidelines. So it seems to be kind of a moving target as far as this transition plan is concerned. And maybe that's part of the reason why there was somewhat of a reluctance to dive full bore into these transition plans because they're constantly changing the guidelines.
Correct. There are new standards that show up, and new ways our understanding keeps increasing, and we find ways to deal with a lot of these gray areas and confusing spots. So all the more reason to get out of your brain the thought that this is a check the box and done, move on. I think we have one over here if you had.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to mention, for anybody who's in the Twin Cities metro area, at the Met Council, we have the regional solicitation for federal transportation funds. We anticipate that the next one, where applications would be due next year, that it'll be a qualifying requirement that agencies either have a completed self-evaluation or transition plan if it's required, or be in the process of working on that. So that would be a qualifying to be able to apply. And the application, the way it's drafted right now, would ask for dates, like date you started the work and date of anticipated completion. If it's not finished, or ask for the date of completion if it is done. So it's just something to be aware of as far as timing and urgency with it, if you're interested in federal transportation funds.
So progress is sort of a prerequisite towards a lot of applications going forward. We had someone over here.
I'm trying to get my head around how to think about compliance and non-compliance in the face of changing regulations and this concept of safe harbor. So anything constructed before 2012, when the 2010 regulations were adopted, is out of compliance. And
Well, likely. Not for sure, but likely.
unless we were like exceeding all requirements at the time in 2009 and we were different in the building. So everything pre-2012 is out of compliance, and then it's the point of the transition plan to prioritize how we can go about addressing non-compliance within that bunch.
For the most part, yes. So the question was, everything installed before the latest ADA guidelines were set up, so pre-2012 is non-compliant. It's not necessarily non-compliant, but you would have to evaluate it. And I'm sorry, what was the second part?
Well, so it's the point of the transition plan to prioritize in that group how
Right.
you would select of that, or which ones go there first and then third.
Right, so the transition plan is your description of what improvements are to be made based on what you learned from your evaluation and when. So we'll get into that here shortly. But that is the whole point, that the self-evaluation feeds into the transition plan. So you're evaluating all your entire infrastructure under the current standards and then developing a transition plan to address those. Does that make sense? So we'll talk about what is in a transition plan. Talk again about the timing, although I think we might be able to skip through that since we've addressed that a lot here. And then some more tips and resources and examples. So once again, we have this slide, which is a carryover from the self-evaluation section. Your evaluation is what you have. Transition plan is how we're making progress. And again, consider the needs of your county, or city. Everybody's agency is different. And the extent of where you focus your effort and how you get this done, you have a lot of judgment decisions to make along the way. A transition plan is required of all public entities that employ at least 50 people. Purpose is to set forth steps necessary to complete those modifications identified in your self-evaluation, and to provide a schedule for completing the modifications. So it has a what component and a when in response to what you find in your evaluation. Here are the minimum requirements. Identify physical obstacles in the public entity that limit accessibility. What does that sound like? Sounds like the evaluation, right? So the transition plan has a section or a portion dedicated to what happened in the self-evaluation. Describe in detail the methods to make facilities accessible. Specify the schedule for achieving compliance. It says if it's longer than 1 year, identify steps for each year. It will be longer than 1 year. I have seen a lot of examples that call out sort of time ranges, saying we're going to take on projects X and Y within the next 3 years. Some do break it down into a year. Originally, when these requirements were laid out, your transition plan was due in 92. The improvements were due in 95. I think we've seen it kind of lag a little behind that. So do your best to identify it. And it is a public document that as you specify funding and approve projects, it's got to go through your funding approval process, right? So make it achievable, make it real. If your agency is big enough to trigger the transition plan requirement, it's also big enough to trigger this requirement of identifying an official responsible for plan implementation, and along with that, a grievance procedure. And then you're required to get input from the public. It's a public process. Extra piece for those entities with responsibility for streets, roads, or walkways. Your transition plan shall include a schedule for providing curb ramps. So that's according to that specific thing we talked about early this morning. Curb ramps must be provided when an alteration affects a crossing. There are no format requirements for the transition plan. So again, you've got a lot of leeway and judgment to make on what you want to do. We do have a sample outline here from that NCHRP document in your workbooks. But again, it's really like taking the previous slide and putting it into a form like this. So your self-evaluation, very common for the data of the self-evaluation to be in the appendix of the report. Maybe in the body of the report, you can talk about when you did your evaluation, sort of what methods you used. Your correction program, so that is your detailed description of how you're going to remove barriers you find. Implementation schedule, that could take the form of narrative. It could be a table with dates. It could be a map. We'll see an example of a map with dates. This is about your person responsible, your contact, ADA contact. A specific section on curb ramp correction. Again, you can in here you can include the requirement to update those curb ramps when an alteration takes place according to the ADA law itself. You may also find that you're going to do a standalone curb ramp project. If you find in your self-evaluation that there's a significant, a lot of non-compliant ramps on either an urban core or a critical pedestrian pathway of some kind, you may want to say, look, we don't have any plans to do a project in this in the next 10 years, but we think it's worth taking on a standalone curb ramp project. Write that in here as well. And then a public involvement record. So this is what we talked about. Evaluation is ongoing, standards change. Your transition plan is a living document. And again, a periodic review, no specific requirements for how often. And the minimum requirements in this case, this is a good example where consider what's best practices. If it's been a while since you've updated, if you've made a number of improvements, go ahead and update it. Look for those opportunities continuously to improve accessibility. It's more about making accessibility improvements a part of your operating procedure, not about checking off a requirement. And then coordination with anyone, your neighboring agencies, your overlapping agencies, never a bad thing. Put this in here again to talk about that. Curb ramps must be modified or installed if they're not there whenever you do an alteration project. So this requirement is worth writing in your transition plan. A lot of templates have that in there. You can move past this. I've said it 4 times. Here's some examples. Again, City of Baxter. They call out on their map projects for 2018, projects for 2019, and so on. Through next 5 years, they've mapped out where their projects are planning to be. And I know they just went through their city council last month or 2 months ago. For Hennepin County and for Clay County, I show the table of contents here so you can begin to see what they have and how many pages are dedicated to it. Again, these are not generally doctoral thesis papers. A lot of the content of it is a matter of a few pages with some supporting maps and documents. So you can see the first 7 pages of Hennepin County is background stuff that wasn't any of the requirements. You've got the Public Works mission and vision, some information on their highway system, their 2040 bicycle transportation plan, and so on. Again, that's not required to be in there, but they feel it's relevant to what they want to talk about and why they're presenting it. They have their compliance efforts from the past. Their self-evaluation is 2 pages, policies, practices, general summary. Their transition plan starts on page 12 and it goes to, can you see that down there? Page 13. So the bulk of the document, not very extensive, but they have a lot of stuff in appendices. For example, their how to file a grievance and the grievance form itself are in the appendix. Their responsible official, their ADA coordinator, is in an appendix. All their self-evaluation data is in Appendix C. So there's some heft to this, but you've already generated all that information in your evaluation. Definition and terms. A lot of the templates consultants might use have sort of a couple dozen key terms that might help the public understand the content of the plan. Not required. Clay County. They've got some background information up here. Background information. They talk about what the current ADA standards are, so what everything's being measured against. Again, ADA coordinator, a grievance procedure. Their self-evaluation is contained within a couple pages here, and then they have a whole series of maps that gets them, it's 18 pages. That's half the document in their maps. We'll show you an example of their maps. So we're not talking about a whole lot of heft here. The self-evaluation is the bulk of your investment, and then your transition plan formalizes the process that you learn from there. So here's an example of their maps of their improvement schedule. We'll zoom in on one. So they call out County Road 117 in Glendon, saying it's a 5-year project range, essentially. This number 2 indicates, based on what you're about to see, it's their second priority project. So they've identified their projects, given them a priority, estimated year of improvements. I crossed out the price values that they put on there. It is public, so you could find them yourself. I just didn't want to make it too easy for you. So then we have some lessons learned, a lot of common ones here, some overlapping ones. Working with a consultant. When it comes to the transition plan, the consultant's got a lot of experience in drafting it, writing it, probably even a template to start with. Staffing, you can hire interns. It's mostly for the self-evaluation, but there's no reason you couldn't have a planner student help draft your plan. And then identifying critical priority areas. Really, that's what this transition plan is. There are some funding sources out there. For example, a recreational trail program or a safe routes to school program can help you take on some of those projects. You don't have this piece of it. It's sort of a funding possibility map. You don't have it, but it will be incorporated into the final document and posted online probably next month. But what this does, and it continues on the next page, based on the type of work you're going to do, there may or may not be some funding available. And the funding sources are abbreviated at the top and then provided down here. Again, we should have included that for you. We will. Right now, you just have it in slide form, just small. Today's day and age, it really makes a lot of sense to post this to the website, your agency website. Not required, but you do have to communicate it, and very easy for people to go to your website and find it. And seek the early involvement of the disabled public, advocacy groups, people who are vocal. Seek their input at the beginning, because it'll point you towards those priority areas. Places that are providing the best benefit to the public to improve accessibility, and also the highest source of liability to your agency in not being compliant there. Communication, yada yada. List of resources if you're interested in more. We've pulled from a lot of these things, but if you're interested in digging deeper, here's some possible areas. And lastly, if over the last couple hours all you did was go cross-eyed and get confused and overwhelmed at what's going on, you'll have this. This is a template transition plan that local road research board prepared 6 years ago. It's very common for consultants, whether it is SRF or someone else. This is a very commonly used, you can see it. It's very common if you pull up any websites, agency websites, they've either used this or started with it and modified it. You might notice a lot of the text in our examples look the same, came from this. So, how do we feel now? Are we intimidated? Did it help? Both? Yes?
Where are contractors in this process? Do we have capable contractors in the state that can do this work for us?
I hope so. Otherwise, it's all for naught, right?
You don't need to name names, but I mean, where is their liability and culpability in this and their educational strategies, tactics?
We do have a full-day construction training coming up. MnDOT's going to be presenting that. That's about a year from now, and MnDOT does offer it every year, right? Most years. Contractors and inspectors do go to those, and so they see what the requirements are. But the whole system is as good as its limiting piece, right? So no matter where that limiting piece comes in, everyone's got to be on board. If the design documents, everything's accessible, and it's not installed properly, that would be on the contractor, and typically they end up taking out a curb ramp and redoing it. We've all seen that. Does that answer your?
Yeah, and is pre-qualification recommended?
Oh yeah. Yeah, they can get certified at the construction course.
Certification, I think?
Yes.
We're beginning certification.
Yeah, so the one offered in about a year will be a certification offering. David?
One thing that I would offer is that the old way of doing things where you just go out there and make it fit as far as the quadrant and the ped ramps and the buttons and the signals and all of that are concerned is pretty much over. It's going to require some very detailed design as far as these quadrants are concerned in order to get them in compliance from the beginning. We've had a number of cases where we've had to tear out the quadrants because we went in and we did the old, well, it looks pretty good, close, well, it's about right. We ended up tearing out the quadrant, costing a lot of extra dollars, where the extra dollars would have been better used on the detailed design. Right now, I'm seeing kind of a disconnect. I do a lot of site plan review stuff, and I see a lot of disconnect with plans that are submitted, lacking sufficient detail to tell us that the quadrant's going to work, whether it's the interaction between the signal, the interaction between the quadrant, the landing area, the curb and gutter, the drainage, whatever elements you want to talk about. So until that education process seems to take that next step and include all stakeholders, I think that we can do a good job here monitoring the system and presenting a plan and developing a plan. But until you get into the design and construction elements, it's a plan.
Yeah, that limiting factor can come anywhere in the process.
Right.
I think we are starting to see this snowball gather some mass and start moving down the hill, and it's all a good thing. Okay.
All
Standard
right,
plans for
we'll talk,
design?
yeah, we'll go for a little bit and then I'll give you a break. Whoa. So the next section we're going to cover is section 5, design.
Four.
Oh, 4, sorry. And then 5, construction. Brady, will you help me hand these out?
Yep.
So I have three handouts for this. One is this first one I'm giving, which is in curb ramps. There's 6 sheets in this standard plan. And then Brady will follow behind me with the 4 sheets of driveway details. And then the last thing that Brady can hand out is the 1 sheet of automated pedestrian signals.
Accessible.
Accessible. I keep saying automated. It's in my head, sorry. They are automated though. But more important, they're accessible. So, you need 2 of them?